Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Friday Ramblings. I am your host, the Bardic one, David Horridan, and today we're going to sit there and we're going to talk about something that's a little bit comics, a little bit video games, a little bit movies, and maybe a little bit more, because we are answering the question of, who is Little Nemo? Little Nemo is, simply put, a character that originated in newspaper comic strips in 1905. Now, the reason we're going to talk about Little Nemo specifically is because, well, having really popular newspaper characters jump around to other mediums is something that we are very familiar with. Peanuts and Garfield being two of the greatest examples. Characters that go well above and beyond the original entertainment medium that they were presented in. Especially that being the newspaper strips. You know, for many years, that was the main place people went to get this kind of regular character development. After all, they would appear every single day. And the really popular ones would even jump between different newspapers, and trust me, back in the day, that was a big deal. Now, these days, you know, newspapers are generally done on a more local level. Everything's run through the Associated Press. But back when you had, you know, William Randolph Hearst and his media empire, comic books jumping from a competitor's newspaper, you know, do back and forth, it was pretty big news. I mean, it was the equivalent nowadays of, you know, a football player jumping not just from one team to another when his contract's over, but specifically jumping to, like, you know, their biggest rival's team. Yeah. It was something people paid attention to, and the newspapers would use to really grab attention and do a little bit of, haha, we're the best, everybody wants to work for us. Because in your big cities like New York, you would have multiple competing newspapers. It was where everybody wanted to get their news. You didn't have the internet. You didn't have 24-hour news networks on television. So it was a business where there could be competition. So all that goes around to talk about Nemo, who did jump back and forth a few times. But that is not the main topic of it. It is, who is Little Nemo? What was so interesting about him? Well, let's go ahead and break down, get into your hard facts. Little Nemo is a fictional character created by American cartoonist Winsor McCay. He originated in an earlier comic strip by McCay, Dream of the Rare Bit Fiend, before receiving his own spin-off series, Little Nemo and Slumberland, or, depending on which year and which publisher you're reading it under, also known as In the Land of Wonderful Dreams. Full-page weekly strip depicted the character of Nemo having fantastical and fantasy-inspired dreams that were always interrupted by his awakening in the final panel, creating a bit of running gag continuity to the strips, as well as reinforcing the fact that this was a dreamland. This was not his reality. Strip is considered McCay's masterpiece, as well as very influential on later generation comics due to his experiments with the form of the comic's page, its use of color, its timing and pacing, the size and shape of its panels, as well as many other artistic details. Those long-running fans of my channel know about how much I adore the Calvin and Hobbes comics, and Bill Watterson himself did a lot of experimenting with panels and layouts, especially in the Sunday strip where he had more space and thus a little more freedom to work with making each strip feel unique by changing the layout, number of panels, size of the panels, the specific arrangement. But this is all stuff Winsor McCay did as well. So, I mean, does that really sound like a big story? Hey, kid goes to sleep and has weird dreams. Well, on the surface it doesn't sound like much, but you have to remember, the strip came out in 1905. Previously to this, people didn't really put a lot of thought into dreams and the psychology of dreams outside of, like actual practicing psychologists and psychiatrists and other mental health professionals. The average person really wasn't doing a lot of understanding that the things you dream about may be a hint as to the things that are bothering you in your waking life. And thus, having a strip that dealt with dream symbolism and dream psychology was actually kind of a big deal, not to mention that Winsor McCay himself was a wonderful artist. His construction of Slumberland or Dreamland was incredibly detailed for a newspaper strip at the time and really could hold its own with any illustrated fantasy novel that had been published as of this point in time. A lot of later artists have, whether directly or indirectly, taken influence on how they construct fantastic looking cities from the Winsor McCay drawings. So, what about the plot specifics of Nemo? Okay, well, let's break this down. As we said, Little Nemo in Slumberland featured the young Nemo, which, by the way, folks, is Latin for no one, pointing out that Nemo himself fit the classic character archetype of the self-insert. The idea is that Nemo was designed to be vague enough in personality and motivation that everybody could relate. He was no one because he was everyone. Everybody dreams. Everybody gets dragged along on things sometimes. Which is ultimately what is going on with Nemo, as first episode begins with King Morpheus of Slumberland issuing an order to one of his minions to collect Nemo so that he could be the playmate of Slumberland's princess. However, due to the green-skinned, cigar-chewing clown named Flip, who would run around and find Nemo first, causing him to prematurely end his dreaming by waking him up, specifically with a top hat emblazoned with the words, "Wake up! Wake up!" It was actually months of strips before Nemo finally arrived in Slumberland proper and met up with the king and the princess. Flip would eventually calm down on his grand quest to keep Nemo from spending too much time in Slumberland, becoming his most constant companion, along with a African imp whom Flip finds in the Candy Islands that, yes, by today's standards would be considered a offensive and somewhat racist caricature, but it is what it is. Visually, it's not something that stands the test of times. But again, we are talking about a strip that is 116 years old. We are not going to get upset at Winsor McCay. We're not going to blame Winsor McCay for any of this. We're going to just understand it was a different time period. Nemo would also meet up with various figures of legend, such as Jack Frost, and, as we said earlier, would demonstrate various aspects of the much less known dream psychology at the time, such as the iconic dream fears of falling, drowning, impalement, and other highly injurious activities. Dream World itself would have its own moral code, allowing various strips to demonstrate the consequences of disrespecting other cultures' morals and ethics. Again, we're not saying Nemo is a bad person for doing any of this. He is a young and curious child. He is doing what any of us would have done in that situation. You're told things like, oh, don't touch this crystal structure. But all you can do is just go, oh, but it's so pretty. Oh no! You touch it, things shatter. You're living and you're learning. That's how you understand consequences. It's something that in various contexts we all did as children. Hence, Nemo is no one because he's everyone. Experiences that we all go through and relate to. Brilliant work for that self-insert style character. Brilliant. An archetype that, when done properly, is perfect for stories about world building and world exploring, not personal development based. Now, for about a year or so in 1908, Slumberland was actually destroyed, and Nemo's dreams would take place in his waking world hometown. These adventures would create more of a down-to-earth feel for the comic, and featured the famous imagery of the walking bed. As I said, it would eventually return to good about a year and a half or so later. Other stories arcs would include Befuddle Hall, famous for its various trying to think of my wording here. Funhouse style mirrors. Where one mirror makes you look super tall and skinny, the other makes you super squat and wide. One makes you look super old, one makes you look like a baby. Crazy Mirror Time befuddles illusions. As well as Voyages to Mars, with a fully developed Martian civilization, and a trip around the world. Now, eventually, of course, the strip would end. Winsor McCay himself would grow old and retire. His son, Robert, would attempt to carry on his father's legacy in the late 30s by reviving Little Nemo, being credited under the writing name of Winsor McCay Jr. There would also be collected comic book style versions of Nemo, including one called Nemo in Adventureland, featuring grown-up versions of Nemo and the Princess, although neither project lasted long, as over enough time, cutting-edge things are no longer cutting edge, and new trends and fads pick up. Nothing in entertainment lasts forever. Various books have been collected, reprinting the McCay originals, strips, as well as collections of the storyboards and original artwork itself, being preserved at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum at Ohio State University. When it comes to collections, probably the best was produced by Sunday Press Books. Which focus on the full-color, full-panel Sunday strips called Little Nemo and Slumberland, So Many Splendid Sundays, mostly due to the fact that it was printed as a 21 by 16 inch size book, and therefore was able to reproduce the pages at the size they originally appeared in newspapers, which means there was no readjusting of size to fit a standard book format, which when you're dealing with something as highly detailed as McKay's art was, can be very bad because you get compression of the art, and therefore the individual details do not stand out. A second volume called Many More Splendid Sundays was put out in 2008, so that is good. It is very much possible to find the Little Nemo newspaper comics nowadays if you do some searching. So let's get into the adaptations, because this is where Little Nemo really gets fun. As early as the strip's first year in 1905, several attempts were made to put Little Nemo on stage, many of which never actually went through, although one show was put on and went on the road for 2 seasons. And in March 2017, again, I'm trying to make sure I got my notes here right, folks. A short one-act adaptation of the Little Nemo Adventures was staged at Fordham University in New York City. The play was simply entitled Little Nemo and Slumberland, and featured a 6-person cast. There was also a 2013 adaptation by the Tailspinner Children's Theater in Cleveland, Ohio. But perhaps the most significant adaptations did come from movies, your film style. In 1984, Arnaud Selignac, again, I'm very much sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, produced and directed a film called Nemo or Dream 1, starring Jason Connery, Harvey Keitel, and Carol Bouquet. While it does involve a little boy named Nemo who wears pajamas and travels to a fantasy world, there is no other connections to the McKay strip, as Nemo encounters characters from other works of fiction rather than those from the original strip, and the fantasy world is portrayed in a much more dark and dismal style. Most famously is the joint American-Japanese feature-length film Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, which was released in Japan in 1989 and in the United States in August 1992 from Hemdale Film Corporation, which featured different people working on it over various years, including icons like Ray Bradbury, Chris Columbus, and Mobius. Story tells of an adventure featuring Nemo and his friends to rescue King Morpheus from the Nightmare King. The princess is given a name in this one, Camille, which is not present in the original comic, as well as Nemo getting the cliche pet flying squirrel named Icarus. Despite so many incredible talents working on it over many years, due to the large budget, as well as the fact that by the 80s, Little Nemo was a by and large forgotten piece of pop culture. As I said, we're going from 1905 to 1992. That is a long time. It was a box office bomb, receiving mixed to positive reviews from publications, and thus hurting its chances for any kind of direct sequels or follow-ups. And for me personally, and this is how we're going to go ahead and wrap this up, folks, as a tie-in to the animated film, Capcom released a video game for the NES which featured Nemo exploring Dreamland, and most importantly to the video game legacy, had a feature wherein Nemo could feed candy to select enemies, and upon feeding them enough pieces of candy, he would befriend them and could ride them. You know, you jump on top of the now friendly one and poof, you become one character now. Riding them and unlocking special abilities unique to each creature. This feature would be adapted only a couple years later for the Kirby games, wherein Kirby would eat certain enemies to gain their unique powers. Although Kirby was not done by Capcom, hey, doesn't mean you can't be inspired by a different company's products. And I have to personally say, as somebody who played the Little Nemo game, and it being my first exposure to the Little Nemo character, it was a hard game. I've never beaten Little Nemo in my lifetime. It is a platform-style game, but more like the later 16-bit style games. It featured more of a open exploratory style platforming where it's like, yes, your point is to jump over enemies and obstacles and get from one side of the stage to the other, but the stages were large enough that, you know, you would see this much, but there'd actually be like this much on the map. And so to collect your items, to get your points for extra lives, or to help, or to even find the goalpost at the end of the level, you had to do a lot of exploring, which is where your different animal companion abilities would come in hand. You had like a mole that could dig, a big old toad that could jump much higher than Nemo can on his own, leading to a feel that, unlike, say, a classic Mario game, was much less hectic and prone to encouraging what nowadays we would call speed running, and more of a adventure style game where you're encouraged to take your time and look for everything there is in the level, fully exploring it. This, of course, is now very common in modern platform gamings, and as I said, would be a bigger thing in the Super Nintendo Genesis era of gaming. Other games before Little Nemo had done it, but Little Nemo was one of the early examples of these style games. And you can definitely tell that they considered that when they designed the levels, as much like Winsor McKay with the original comic strips. The levels are designed with very clear fantasy elements and a lot of details that you are not going to appreciate if you just quickly dash from one side to the other, only concerning yourself with hitting the goalpost as quick as possible. You want to explore. The game encourages you to explore. You need to explore because it's just so cool looking and there's just so much to see. So, where do we wrap things up? Why did you need to learn about Little Nemo? Well, because he's one of those characters that not everybody instinctively thinks about. They might recognize the character himself if they saw art of him. But Nemo is one of those characters that has been very significant to pop culture. This is somebody that has been presented in comic form, in live theater, in movies, in video games, I think really every format except the old radio plays. I'm sure somebody considered that at the time. I mean, I think they even tried to do some operas and stuff about them. Winsor McCay's experiments with layout and art style would influence multiple generations of comic strip artists. Many artists, especially those who were working in the 80s and 90s when newspaper strips were still big business, even though the rivalry papers in big cities had kind of faded, as we stated at the beginning of the video, would cite Winsor McCay's works as some of their influences artistically. You know, as I said, go look up some of the newspaper strips. The visuals are incredible. You know, almost nobody was drawing strips the way Winsor McCay was at the time. And the fact that he had successful newspaper strips before this is part of that, which, you know, for my more creative folks, that's going to be part of the lesson we're going to take from this is, you know, Winsor just didn't walk off the street and have instant success in 1905. He had been working as a commercial artist and as a newspaper strip creator for a few years before Nemo. You know, he worked at his craft, he built up his reputation until he came upon something that was just so much more successful than anything he did before that its influence outlasted him. So, you know, that's just it. Is, hey, you like watching movies? There's the Little Nemo movies. You like reading comics? There's Little Nemo comics. You like playing video games? There's a Little Nemo video game. It's very retro and nostalgic by now, but it's out there. You can find it. And it's still a license that, if respectfully and properly adapted, can fit for any generation. You know? It is a classic story of a child doing what children do. Being curious, being adventurous, wanting to seek out new games and playmates all the time. Every night was a new dream and a new adventure for Nemo. And because of that, you had an entire generation of readers who grew up believing that as well, that every day was a new chance for a new adventure and to make new friends. So hey, come at it with positivity. And that's what we do on the Ramblings. We celebrate our entertainment. We enjoy our culture. And even if it's something that I'm not a huge fan of, believe it or not, those things do exist. I just choose not to dwell on them too much. I do at least try to find the silver lining for you folks. So, keep tuning in every Friday. Hang out with the channel on other days if you want to watch our other shows. But definitely comment, subscribe, and keep watching, because every Friday I'm going to ramble, and I'd like you to be here. Maybe next time I won't have so much sunlight trying to blind my face out. But you got to do things when you can do them. We're working on it, and we're getting better every time. Progress. Until then, enjoy your dreams, enjoy your slumber, and be like Nemo. Always look for the next adventure just around the corner. Bye-bye, folks.